please be advised that there is material that will be presented that is not AA conference approved material. We believe that Joe and Charlie clearly state when they present material that is not AA conference approved material. The presentation has been color-coded to better assist you as to the origin of the information.
They decided to put Bill's story in the big book immediately following the doctor's opinion. And a lot of people today say, well, we can't identify with Bill because after all, he was a night school lawyer and we were not. He was a New York City stock speculator and we were not. A lot of the women say, well, we couldn't identify with him because he's a man and he doesn't think the way we think. But if we really carefully read Bill's story, I think each one of us are going to be able to identify with Bill Wilson. We're going to be able to identify with the way that he thought, by his attitude and outlook toward life, people, places, and things in general. We're going to be able to identify with his drinking. In Bill's story, we're going to see him start with drinking for fun and excitement. We're going to see it progress to the point of where he has to drink every day and almost every night. We see it progress to the point where he has to drink out of absolute, complete necessity in order to live. And then we're going to see it progress to the point where he's drinking for the sickest reason of all, absolute, complete oblivion, just to get out of life, period. And if we read and study Bill's story, I think each one of us is going to be able to identify with him. The greatest thing we're going to see in Bill's story is how he effected a recovery from alcoholism. And if we're a new person, never had any contact with the fellowship, the book is the first and only contact we've got, and we read and study Bill's story and identify with him, and we can say we're enough like him that if this guy could recover from alcoholism, just maybe we could too. The beginning of belief, the beginning of hope that maybe we could solve our alcohol problem just like Bill Wilson solved his. So this morning as we go through Bill's story, let's look for identification, let's look for the progression of his illness, and then let's see how he actually recovered from alcoholism. Joe?
See, I didn't know you were supposed to identify with Bill. I read Bill's story and didn't mean much to me at the time. I thought, well, what can an old man teach me? I was very young when I first got here. Saw this picture of Bill. Looked like an old man to me. But he was 43 years old when his book was published. A relatively young man. So identification was a process I began. And as I began to look into Bill's story, I began to see that Bill was a very optimistic individual. He was our hard-working guy, self-made man. Lots and lots of willpower, Bill was, just like us, just like me. And I began to see in Bill's story the whole story of Alcoholics Anonymous in Bill's story, all in one chapter. As Charlie said, I learned what he was like. And we learned from reading Bill's story how he learned he was sick, and most importantly, how he effected a recovery. The total story of Alcoholics Anonymous is in Bill's story, and it was there if I was able to read it. But identification, I need to identify with this guy named Bill. Not so much that he was a night school lawyer, but the feelings that he had and the emotions that he had in between the lines. So let's go to chapter 1, Bill's story.
Let's put ourselves in a position now, never having met anybody from AA. The big book is the first contact we've had with this thing. And reading Bill's story, this is our first opportunity to really be able to see another alcoholic and identify.
He said, war fever ran high in the New England town to which we new young officers from Plattsburgh were assigned. We were flattered when the first citizens took us to their homes, making us feel heroic. Here was love, applause, war, moments sublime with intervals hilarious. Anybody ever have any moments sublime with intervals hilarious while drinking? I like the way Bill writes, don't you? He said, I was part of life at last, and in the midst of the excitement I discovered liquor. I forgot the strong warnings and the prejudices of my people concerning drink. In time we sailed for over there. I was very lonely and again turned to alcohol. We landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. My attention was caught by a doggerel on an old tombstone. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking cold small beer. A good soldier never forgot whether he died by musket or by pot.
Now, for you younger guys, that pot we're referring to here is not that wacky weed that you've been using. This is the way they used to sell beer all the time, a pot of beer. That's what he's talking about.
I have some pictures here which I'm going to lay out, and you're welcome to come by and look at them when you can. But here's the picture of that tombstone that Bill was talking about. There's a lot more wording on there than what he just stated. The name on there is Thomas Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher, Thomas Thatcher, who knows? But it's there for you to look at. Picture of Bill, some little statements that's on Bill's bedroom wall in his home in Connecticut. Bill and Lois's grave, picture of Bill and Lois's grave in Vermont. Dr. Silkworth headstone here. A couple of years ago in the summer, we were in Albany, New York, and we learned that Ebby Thatcher was buried in Albany. I thought he was down in Texas. But Charlie and I learned about him, and we went out to his grave, and the weeds were about this high. Hadn't been in one there in years. And we cleaned off the grave and took a picture of the headstone. The fellow who was with us was pretty well-to-do, and he gave the caretaker of the cemetery money to keep that grave cleaned off and mowed. Because without this guy, there's no AA. He carries the message to Bill. Ebby did. Very, very important. And then there's the gatehouse where Bill and Bob first met. And these are all up here for you to look at. Dr. Bob's tombstone is here. Dr. Bob's memorial at the 24th Street Clubhouse in New York, given by Bill Wilson in 1952, a little statement that he made. So these are all here for you to look at if you would like to. And the book goes on and says, ominous warning which I failed to heed. 22 in a veteran of foreign wars, I went home at last. I fancied myself a leader, for had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation, my talent for leadership, I imagine, would place me at the head of vast enterprises, which I would manage with the utmost assurance. Bill was very optimistic, wasn't he? So I took a night law course and obtained employment as an investigator for a surety company. The drive for success was on. I'd prove to the world that I was important.
I already identified with Bill Wilson. All I ever wanted to do was become a success and prove to the world that I'm important too. Spent almost all my life trying to do that. I certainly identify with Bill Wilson. One of the driving characteristics behind every alcoholic I've ever known. By God, we're going to show them. We're going to prove to them that we're just as important as they are. I identify with Bill immediately.
My work took me about Wall Street, and little by little I became interested in the market. Many people lost money, but some became very rich. Well, why not I? I studied economics and business as well as law. Potential alcoholic that I was, I nearly failed my law course. At one of the finals, I was too drunk to think or to write. Though my drinking was not yet continuous, it disturbed my wives. I can identify with Bill on that occasion. We had long talks when I would still her forebodings by telling her that men of genius conceive their best projects when drunk. That the most majestic construction of philosophic thought was so derived.
Anybody in here identify with Bill Wilson?
Charlie said last night we make our living selling fast talk to slow-thinking people. Well, Bill's trying to sell some of that right here, you see. By the time I had completed the course, I knew the law was not for me. The inviting maelstrom of Wall Street had me in his grip. Business and financial leaders were my heroes. Out of this alloy of drink and speculation, I commenced to forge a weapon that would one day turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. Living modestly, my wife and I saved $1,000. It went into certain securities, then cheap and rather unpopular. I rightly imagined they would someday have a great rise. I failed to persuade my broker friends to send me out looking over factories and management. But my wife and I decided to go anyway. I developed the theory that most people lost money in stocks through ignorance of markets. I discovered many more reasons later on.
Bill is referring to a time back in the 1920s when the stock market was on the roll. Just about everybody that dealt with it made money out of it. About all you had to do was buy stock, hold on to it for a while, let it go up in value, sell it, buy some more, hold on to it, sell it, buy some more. Nearly everything was being done on a real cheap margin basis. You only had to put down about 10% of the cost of it in order to be able to buy it. Bill became really one of the first investment counselors on Wall Street. He began to say, look, sooner or later, this bubble's going to burst. He said, sooner or later, we're going to have to start making our decisions on what to buy and what to sell based on fact rather than speculation. He said, no, I don't have the money to do this, but if you guys would back me financially, I'll go out and I'll start visiting these companies in person. I'll look over the plant. I'll look at the books wherever I can. I'll talk to the employees. I'll write up reports on them. I'll send them back into Wall Street, and we'll start making our decisions based on fact. And they said, no, Bill, thank you. We don't need that kind of information. They said, we're making about all the money we want to make anyhow. Well, you know how we alcoholics are when we get a good idea. Stubborn and bullheaded to the extreme. We want to carry it through come hell or high water. Bill said, well, to hell with them. I don't need them anyhow. He said, we gave up our positions and off we roared on a motorcycle. The sidecar stuffed with tent blankets, a change of clothes, 3 huge volumes of a financial reference service. Our friends thought a lunacy commission should be appointed. Perhaps they were right. I had had some success in speculation, so we had a little money, but we once worked on a farm for a month to avoid drawing on our small capital. That was the last honest manual labor on my part for many a day. We covered the whole eastern United States in a year. Bill and Lois, riding on this motorcycle, living in a tent, traveled up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States, visited approximately 100 of the largest companies at that time. Bill, in turn, wrote up these reports, sent them back into Wall Street. And when the people saw them on Wall Street, they said, oh, yeah, man, this is great information. He said, at the end of it, my reports to Wall Street procured me a position there and the use of a large expense account. They immediately put Bill on the payroll, gave him a large expense account. The exercise of an option brought in more money, leaving us with a profit of several $1,000s for that year. Now, Bill was from a little town up in Vermont called East Dorset, had never had anything before in his life. And all of a sudden now, here he is on Wall Street. He got a great job, got a good expense account. He's made several $1,000s, which is a lot of money back in the 1920s, based on exercising an option. He said, for the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. I had arrived. How many of us have done the same damn thing? This literally worked our tails off, and the day we get there, my God, what a great feeling it is. My judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions. The great boom of the late 20s was seething and swelling. Drink was taking an important, exhilarating part in my life. Now, Bill doesn't know he's alcoholic. He just knows that he loves to drink. There was loud talk in the jazz places uptown. Everyone spending thousands and shattered in millions. Scoffers could scoff and be damned. I made a host of fair weather friends. And here's old Bill on top of the heap. And he got lots of money coming in. He's drinking and he's having a lot of fun with it. And he really is a success on Wall Street. But we know, as a practicing alcoholic, it's going to get worse as time goes by. He said, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. The remonstrances of my friend terminated in a row, and I became a lone wolf. You know, people begin to say to Bill, you're drinking too much. Bill, why don't you cut back? Bill, you're costing us money. Bill, why don't you quit? And Bill did the same thing so many of us did. He said, to hell with them. I don't need them anyhow. He begins to operate on his own now. He's become a lone wolf. There were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes.
I believe just about everything Bill ever wrote, but I'm not sure about that one. Bill wrote a little book called As Bill Sees It. Lois wrote one called Lois Remembers. There's quite a bit of difference between the two.
Let's go.
Bill's doing good, isn't he? Drinking good whiskey and jazz places uptown, having fun. Bill's on top of the world, drinking good, living good, feeling good, making lots of money. But on page 4.
Let's go to page 4, first paragraph.
Bill's got lots of willpower, lots of optimism, lots of success, self-made man. He's doing good. But on page 4 in the first paragraph, abruptly in October 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. After one of those days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. It was 8 o'clock. 5 hours after the market had closed, the ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of tape which bore the inscription XYZ32. It had been 52 that morning. He said, well, I was finished, so were many friends. The papers reported men jumping for the death from towers of high finance. He said, that disgusted me. I would not jump. I went back to the bar. So Bill had a solution for that. My friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. Well, so what? Tomorrow was another day. And as I drank, that old fierce determination to win came back.
And many of us have done the same thing. We've come out of the hospital, the jailhouse, the divorce court, low, sad, and depressed. Stop off in the bar and have a couple of drinks. And as the alcohol courses through our veins, the old determination to win comes back. We say, we'll show them. By God, they're not going to treat us that way. And we're off and running again. That great, great desire to succeed.
So the next morning I telephoned a friend in Red Deer. He had plenty of money left and thought I'd better go to Canada. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba, no St. Helena for me. But drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. This time we stayed broke. In America, we know that all the money's up here in Canada. All the good money. Now, here's old Bill again. He's really had been doing real well, very successful. And now he says, we went to live with my wife's parents. That's got to hurt a guy like old Bill. He said, I found a job and lost the results as abroad with a taxi driver.
We see the progression of the illness of alcoholism gradually getting worse as time goes by.
Mercy, no one would guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years or hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. I became an unwelcome hanger-on to brokerage places. Those places where Bill had made lots of people a lot of money, was very welcomed at one time. Now they're saying to Bill, why don't you just move on down the street a little bit? You don't smell too good. You don't look good. You're not making us any money, so just move along if you don't mind. And that's got to hurt a guy like Bill. It really does. And we know that alcoholism is a progressive illness. Now Bill is going to start drinking for a whole different reason.
He said, liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. We're not drinking now for fun. We're not drinking for excitement. Now then, we're drinking in order to live. Bathtub gin, 2 bottles a day, and often 3 got to be routine. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100s, and I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. A tumbler full of gin, followed by half a dozen bottles of beer, would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope.
Things are bad for old Bill, but they're going to get worse.
I remember last night Dr. Silkworth said we really cannot differentiate the true from the false. We can see Bill's life going to hell in a handbasket already. Bill can't see that. He thinks he can still control the situation. Gradually things got worse. Always does. Progression. The house was taken over by the mortgage holder. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at the low point of 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and that chance vanished. That's a story within itself. These people that knew Bill knew how good he was at putting these stock deals together. They went to see Bill, and they said, Bill, we've got a deal for you. That if you can stay sober, you can put this thing together. And you can make not only us money, but you can make a lot of money for yourself. Bill said, oh, don't you worry about that drinking. He said, I'm through with that drinking anyhow. And he began to put this deal together, worked on it for 2 or 3 months. Just before they were to complete it, They're all sitting around in a hotel room. Somebody passed around a bottle of Applejack. This was during Prohibition days. It came to Bill, and Bill said, "No, thank you, I'm not drinking." And it went on by Bill, and after a while, the bottle came back. And the guy sitting next to Bill said, "Bill, you don't realize what's in this bottle." He said, this Applejack is called Jersey Lightning. He said, "It's the finest Applejack ever made. You better have a drink of it." And Bill's mind said, I've never tasted any Jersey Lightning. And no more thought than that, he reached out, grabbed the bottle, took a drink, triggered the allergy, and ended up blowing the whole deal. Now the importance in that lies within the next statement. He said, "I woke up. This had to be stopped. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever." For the first time, Bill could differentiate the true from the false. For the first time, he could really see what alcohol's doing to him. He did the same thing I did, and the same thing all you guys did. He trotted out his willpower, and he said, "Sick 'em, Will. We're through with that drinking. We're not ever going to take another drink as long as we live."
See, Bill doesn't know what we learned last night. That anytime there's a battle going on between the willpower and the obsession of the mind is stronger than the will always win out, but he doesn't know that.
He said, "I'd written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business, and so I did." Now let's see how he did on willpower.
He said, "Shortly afterward I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind."
Is there anybody in here besides me that identifies with Bill Wilson? You betcha.
Someone had pushed a drink my way and I'd taken it. Was I crazy? See, if your willpower don't work, then you begin to question your sanity. Am I just crazy? Is that it? He said, "I began to wonder for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. Now, renewing my resolve, I tried again. Some time passed and confidence began to be replaced by cocksureness. I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. In no time I was beating on the bar asking myself how it happened. As the whiskey rose to my head, I told myself I would manage better next time, but I might as well get good and drunk then, and I did." Anybody identify with Bill Wilson in that area? Certainly I do. He said, "The remorse and horror and hopelessness of the next morning are unforgettable. The courage to do battle was not there. My brain raced uncontrollably, and there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. Certainly I can identify with Bill. I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again, well, so had I. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Gin would fix that. So 2 bottles, and I believe in. See, if your willpower doesn't work, and you question your sanity and don't get any answers, you begin to contemplate suicide. Should I kill myself? No, not now, he said. And then he starts drinking for the sickest effect of all, total oblivion. He just wanted out of it. And those of us who drink for oblivion know that there's only one thing wrong with it, is you wake up and you start all over again. And that's where we find Bill at this moment.
He said, "The mind and body are marvelous mechanisms, for mine endured this agony 2 more years. Sometimes I stole from my wife's slender purse when the morning terror and madness were on me. Again I swayed dizzily before an open window or the medicine cabinet where there was poison, cursing myself for a weakling. There were flights from city to country and back as my wife and I sought escape. Then came the night when the physical and mental torture was so hellish, I feared I would burst through my window, sash and all. Somehow I managed to drag my mattress to a lower floor, lest I suddenly leap. A doctor came with a heavy sedative. Next day found me drinking both gin and sedative, and this combination soon landed me on the rocks. People feared for my sanity, so did I. I could eat little or nothing when drinking, and I was 40 pounds underweight. Now we see a guy that's reaching the end. He's dying from malnutrition, 40 pounds underweight. Unless something happened pretty soon, Bill probably wouldn't have been around very much longer. He said, "My brother-in-law is a physician, and through his kindness and that of my mother, I was placed in a nationally known hospital for the mental and physical rehabilitation of alcoholics. This is the Towns Hospital in New York City. Under the so-called belladonna treatment, my brain cleared. Belladonna was a drug that they used in order to withdraw from alcohol. Today they use Valium for the same purposes. Those days it was called belladonna. Hydrotherapy and mild exercise help much. Hydrotherapy is water treatment. And we were fortunate enough to see one of these old-style treatment centers. And they would strap the alcoholic down on a gurney, roll him into a shower room, and there were shower heads all the way around the room, alternating hot and cold water on him. And he was in there for about 30 minutes to an hour. It doesn't cure alcoholism, but it sure as hell makes a clean drunk out of you, I'll guarantee you that. Old boys that come out of that thing, their skin so damn wrinkled up they didn't even look human anymore. He said, best of all, I met a kind doctor who explained that though certainly selfish and foolish, I had been seriously ill bodily and mentally. This is when Bill met Dr. Silkworth, and Silky explained to Bill his ideas about alcoholism, the physical allergy of the body, and the obsession of the mind. And Bill said it relieved me somewhat that I learned that in alcoholics the will is amazingly weakened when it comes to combating liquor, though it often remains strong in other respects. My incredible behavior in the face of a desperate desire to stop was explained. Understanding myself now, for the first time, he understood the problem. For the first time, he understood why he could no longer drink without getting drunk and why willpower wouldn't work on alcoholism. He said, understanding myself now, I fared forth in high hope. For 3 or 4 months, the goose hung high. I went to town regularly and even made a little money. Surely this was the answer, self-knowledge. Now let's see where Bill went on self-knowledge.
Self-knowledge is good, but it wasn't enough. But it was not, for the frightful day came when I drank once more. The curve of my declining moral and bodily health fell off like a ski jump. And after a time, I returned to the hospital.
Now, the first time was the summer of 1933. Not too long after that, he started drinking. And now then it's a year later. He's been drinking for almost a year again, back in the Towns Hospital in the summer of 1934.
This was the finish of the curtain, it seemed to me. My weary and despairing wife was informed that all end with heart failure during delirium tremens, or I've developed a wet brain perhaps within a year. She would soon have to give me over to the undertaker of the asylum. Bill was laying in there sobering up one more time, and he heard Lois ask Dr. Silkworth, she said, do you think he's going to make it this time? And he said, Lois, I don't believe he's going to make it at all. We're going to have to give him over to the undertaker of the asylum, because I don't think he's got enough to come back. And see, you can't scare an alcoholic into staying sober. Because the next statement said they did not need to tell me. I knew and almost welcomed the idea. So you can't scare an alcoholic into staying sober, although they tried. He said it was a devastating blow to my pride. I, who had thought so well of myself and my abilities, of my capacity to surmount obstacles, was cornered at last. Now I was plunged into the dark, joining that endless session of sots that had gone on before. I thought of my poor wife. There had been much happiness after all. What would I not give to make amends? But that was over now. Bill was laying there, and he was powerless over alcohol. His life was unmanageable, and he was hopeless and helpless to do anything about it. Had no solution whatsoever. And that's where we find Bill right now.
Now let's look at this next statement very, very carefully. He said, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Quicksand stretched around me in all directions. I had met my match. I had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was my master. I've never seen a better description of step one. No step one written in those days. But here's where Bill took it. Here's where he admitted he was absolutely, completely powerless over alcohol. Alcohol had whipped him in a fair fight. Alcohol had become his master. Now, if that should happen to you and I today, we would probably say, well, that being the case, I guess I better go to AA. But Bill didn't have any AA to go to. He's in the best treatment facility that he knows of. And even though he's taken what we know today as step one, admitted complete defeat, the only thing he can do is leave that hospital and try to stay sober. Trembling, I stepped from the hospital a broken man. Fear sobered me for a bit. Then came the insidious insanity of that first drink. And on Armistice Day 1934, I was off again. Everyone became resigned to the certainty that I would have to be shut up somewhere, or would stumble along to a miserable end. How dark it is before the dawn. In reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted in what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. I imagine it was a pretty bleak November. He took a drink on Armistice Day, November the 11th. He's been drunk now for about 3 weeks. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. If you notice that, that's in squiggly writing. Very important to Bill. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. He's referring to Ebby Thatcher, the old school buddy, the old drinking buddy. Bill hadn't heard from him in a long time, and all of a sudden here's Ebby in New York, and he's not only in New York, by golly, he's sober. This amazes Bill. He said rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. The last thing Bill had heard about Ebby is Ebby was to be committed to the state insane asylum in the state of Vermont for what they called alcoholic insanity. This was way before the days of the treatment centers. That's what they used to do with people like us. They would haul us in front of a judge. The judge would commit us to the state insane asylum for an undetermined period of time.
Till you got well.
You would stay there until you got well.
Think about that.
And about anybody could do that for you. Your spouse could. One of your adult children could. Members of the law enforcement agencies could. Or any well-meaning friend could do that for you too. And last he heard, Ebby was supposed to be in the nut house in Vermont.
Ebby Thatcher, his prominent family in Albany, New York. In fact, his father was the mayor of Albany and was running for re-election, and Ebby's drinking was embarrassing him in his campaign to be re-elected. So he called him in the office one day and said, Ebby, I want you to go over to East Dorset, Vermont, basically get out of town. That's what they did with drunks in those days. And sent him over there, and while you're over there, you might as well fix up and clean up the old home place, because we'll be over there this summer. So Ebby went over there. Naturally, he had to have a little drink, and he was cleaning up and fixing and painting up the old home place, and one day he stood back admiring his paint job on the side of the house, and watched these pigeons doing some things on the side of the house that he didn't like. So he went in the house and got his shotgun and come back out and started shooting at the pigeons, blowing holes in the side of the house. Well, the neighbors don't like this. So they came over there and called the police and had him arrested and took before the judge for alcoholic insanity. Well, Ebby got very, very fortunate right here, because there was two fellows. One guy's name was Roland Hazard and the other was Seaber Graves. They interceded on Ebby's behalf. Just so happened the judge's name was Graves, Judge Graves, with the father of one of these people who was interceding. And Roland and Seaber were going to the Oxford groups, and they told the judge that if they would release Ebby to their care and let them take him to the Oxford group, maybe they could help him. Well, the judge didn't want to put him in jail then any more than they do now. So they released Ebby to their care. He took him to the Oxford groups, introduced him to the tenets of the Oxford groups. And sure enough, he began to go to meetings, apply the Oxford group tenets to his life, and stayed sober. He stayed sober about 3 months and decided he'd go back to New York. He went back to New York, and he was living in the Calvary Mission. It's the headquarters of the Oxford groups in New York at that time. And while he was there, he remembered his friend Bill. He said, I think I'll go over and help Bill with his drinking problem if I can. He said, of course he would have dinner, and then I would drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. That very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. He thought Ebby was going to come over, and he and Ebby would drink and relive some old good times together.
The door opened and he stood there fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table and he refused it. Disappointed but curious, I wondered what got into the fella. He wasn't himself. Come, what's all this about? I queried. And he looked at me simply but smilingly. He said, I've got religion. Damn glad that didn't happen in my kitchen. I have no idea what I would have done. But here's what Bill did. He said I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yeah, the old boy was on fire, all right. But bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court, persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea,
which is step 2.
And a practical program of action,
which is steps 3 through 12.
That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. So for the first time now, Bill knows all 3 things. He got the problem from Dr. Silkworth in the summer of 1933. Now here in the latter part of November of 1934, he gets the solution referred to here as a simple religious idea, and he gets the program of action necessary to find that solution. Now remember, Ebby's coming out of the Oxford groups. The Oxford groupers were a group of people practicing first century Christianity to the best of their ability. Many of the terms that they used were highly religious in nature. And Bill didn't like this simple religious idea, any more than I didn't like it either. And any more than none of we alcoholics liked the simple religious idea when we first started hearing about this thing. So immediately Bill goes on the defensive. Immediately he starts arguing with Ebby about this simple religious thing. I wish I'd been there that day. I can see Ebby coming in there 2 or 3 months sober, on fire with this simple religious idea. He's trying to give it to Bill. And I can see Bill sitting there, been drunk for 3 weeks, still drunk, and arguing with Ebby about this simple religious idea. That would have been something to see, wouldn't it?
Said he'd come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. I was shocked, but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. See, Bill had already took what we knew to be step 1. He'd already admitted that alcohol was his master. And he was shocked with this message that Ebby had brought him, but he was interested in it because he'd already took step 1. Now on page 10 and 11, we know that Bill took step 1. He was presented with a solution, and one that he didn't like, and he begins to contemplate the solution. He's between steps 1 and steps 2 on page 10 and 11. He said he'd talk for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of that preacher's voice as I sat on those still Sundays way over there on the hillside. There was that pauper temperance pledge I never signed. My grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings. His insistence that the spirits really had the music. His denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness of this, he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. That wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back. Bill's grandfather raised Bill. Bill's father ran off to Canada. Bill's mother went off to become an osteopathic physician and left Bill with grandfather Griffin and his grandmother. He was raised there, and his grandfather Griffin was right. The Griffin house, the Wilson Inn is on this corner, and right across the street is a beautiful white church. It's still there today. It's just gorgeous. And right next to it is the Griffith House. And in the Griffith House, the preacher was always trying to get Grandfather Griffin to listen in a certain way. And the grandfather had a run and gun battle. He was always fighting over this with the preacher, and Bill heard that. Bill is instilled with the idea that you could listen to God as you understand Him through his grandfather, basically. He said, I always believed in the power greater than myself. I'd often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces at work. But despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. How could there be such a precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in the spirit of the universe, who knew neither time nor limitation. But that was as far as I'd gone. With ministers in the world's religion, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated, and my mind snapped shut against such theories. Bill's saying, in other words, there's got to be a harder way to do this. What you're saying is just too simple, but I'm going to find a hard way.
He said, to Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claim him. His moral teaching most excellent. For myself, I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. Anybody in here besides me identify with Bill Wilson? Man, he's reading my mail for me right now. The wars which had been fought, the burnings and chicanery that religious dispute had facilitated made me sick. I honestly doubted whether on balance the religions of mankind had done any good. Judging what I'd seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. The brotherhood of man a grim jest. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal, and he certainly had me. But my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Then he had in effect been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at that minute, and this was none at all. Whether Bill likes what Ebby's bringing to him or not is beside the point. Ebby is sitting there as living proof that some power greater than human power was working in Ebby's life. Bill knew Ebby. He knew how Ebby drank. And he knew that if Ebby was staying sober, some power had to be working in Ebby's life. And that's what you and I are today when we go visit the newcomer. Whether he likes the idea of a higher power or not is beside the point. We're sitting there as living proof that some power greater than human power has worked in our lives also. And we are the proof of it to the newcomer, just like Ebby was the proof of it to Bill. And even though Bill can see that, and even though he's become convinced that some power had to be working in Ebby's life, he still didn't like the idea. We're still talking about religion. Let's go over to page 12.
He said, despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. Prejudice means old ideas, by the way. The word God still aroused in a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. Ebby was members of the Oxford group who was coming from the first century Christianity, basically, and he was talking about the letter of the law. And Bill was interested in the spirit of the law. Two different things. He said, I could go for such conception of creative intelligence, universal mind or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of the desire of the heavens, however loving his way might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way.
I can almost see those two guys sitting there arguing about this religious idea. And Bill's saying, oh yeah, I could call him the great mind or the spirit of the universe or the universal something or other, but don't give me that God stuff. Ebby's sitting there talking about religion and the God of religion, arguing back and forth, and I guess Ebby finally got tired of it. Let's look at the next paragraph very, very closely. He said, my friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. And you'll notice this is in squiggly writing.
It's italic.
Very important. He said, well, Bill, why don't you choose your own conception of God? In effect, what he really said is, what are we arguing about? What difference does it make what we call him? He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And the instant he said that, his message changed from a religious message to a spiritual message. You see, religion says this is the way you have to believe. Spirituality says it really doesn't make any difference how you believe. The only question is, are you willing to believe? Now we're talking about spirituality, no longer talking about religion. And here's the effect it had on Bill. He said that statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain whose shadow I'd lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And that little statement of Ebby's has opened the door for literally millions of we alcoholics to start trying to find a power greater than human power. And I think the reason that it works for us so well, why don't you choose your own conception of God? I think the reason it's worked for us so well is we've never had any problem with our own conception of anything. You betcha. Let us believe in God the way we want to. Now we're ready to go.
I don't believe that Ebby was smart enough to ever be able to come up with that idea. I think he came up with that idea out of complete frustration. Because Bill was talking about creative intelligence, universal mind, spirit of nature. And I think out of frustration, Ebby finally said to Bill, oh, hell, Bill, just believe whatever you want to. Sick and tired of arguing with you. And that, like I said, Charlie said, that little statement opened up the door for literally millions of us people who could have a God of our own understanding.
Surely this is when Bill took step 2. No step 2 written in those days. But this is where Bill came to believe that a power greater than himself would be able to help him out through the simple little statement, well, why don't you choose your own conception of God? If you notice, he said, upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. And this reference to the foundation. Bill is going to start painting a picture in our mind as we go through the book. And the picture is going to be of a great spiritual structure. And he said the foundation of this structure through which we're going to pass to freedom is the simple little idea of being willingness. Willingness is the foundation of the structure. And willingness comes through step 1. When we're out there and we're drinking and we're doing our thing and we've tried it as long as we can try it and we absolutely can't live that way any longer, then we become willing to change things. That's the foundation of the structure. Later on we're going to see where believing is the cornerstone of the structure. Later on he'll tell us exactly what that structure is. So we're going to begin to build that structure now as we go through the book. Ebby started taking Bill to Oxford group meetings immediately. But remember, the allergies got him. He can't stop drinking. He has to go back into the town's hospital a 3rd time now. And on page 13, we're going to see where Ebby came to visit with Bill in the hospital. They begin to apply the little Oxford group program of action in order to be able to find the solution or this spiritual experience or this spiritual idea. We've seen Bill take steps 1 and 2. Let's see if we can't see the last 10 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous as Bill applied them in his life in the town's hospital on page 13. Joe?
He said, at the hospital I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. There I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing. Without him I was lost.
The first step in the Oxford Group program was surrender. And we see Bill there making his surrender. Later on, Bill, no self-respecting alcoholic, wants to surrender. So he changed that to make a decision. There we see Bill taking what we know today as step 3. Made a decision, turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him.
He said, I ruthlessly faced my sins.
Their next step was examine your sins. And Bill knew no self-respecting alcoholic would do that. So he changed that to make a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. There he's taking what we know today as step 4.
And became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch. I've not had a drink since.
Became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch. You'll notice friend is capitalized. That's one of the words that Bill uses for God in here. We see him there taking what we know today as step 6 and 7. We became willing to have God remove these defects of character and humbly ask him to do so. We see him there in that statement taking what we know today as step 6 and 7.
My schoolmate visited me and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies.
There he's taking what we know today as step 5 with Ebby. Ebby came to see him and they had a step called confession and sharing. And Bill changed that to what we know as step 5 today. Admitted to God ourselves, the another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs.
He said, we made a list of people I'd heard and toward whom I felt resentment. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals admitting my wrong. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability.
The Oxford Groupers had a step called restitution. And Bill knew no alcoholic would like the word restitution. So he changed that to steps 8 and 9, where we made the list and then we began to make amends to the people on that list. There we see 8 and 9.
I was to test my thinking by the new God conscious within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense.
There we see what became step 10, where we continued to take personal inventory and when we're wrong, promptly admitted it.
I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore on my usefulness to others. Then only might I expect to receive, but that would be in great measure.
There we see all the elements of step 11, where we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, so on and so forth.
My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator, that I would have the elements of the way of living which answered all my problems.
That's got to be the first part of step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps.
Belief in the power of God, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were essential requirements.
So we see Bill in the town's hospital using the Oxford Group program, which turned out later to be the last 10 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is why he was able to say and how it works, these are the steps we took. He took them as the Oxford Group program, later rewrote them, added to them, and made them the last 10 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now let's see the result that Bill received from that program of action.
These were simple but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father Light who presides over us all. Poor old alcoholics got to give up the two most important things in our lives. One is our alcohol and the other is our self-centeredness. Simple, but not easy. Now these were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I'd never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up, as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. For a moment I was alarmed and called my friend the doctor to ask if I was still sane. He listened in wonder as I talked. Finally he shook his head saying, something's happened to you I don't understand, but you better hang on to it. Anything is better than the way you were. The good doctor now sees men who've had such experiences. He knows they are real.
We don't know what happened to Bill that day. We were not there to see that. But we do know this was probably about December the 12th or 13th of 1934. We do know that Bill didn't die until January of 1971. It was never necessary for him to take a drink for the rest of his life. Something profound happened to Bill that day in that hospital as the result of these steps. He always said he had a vital spiritual experience during which old ideas were cast aside and replaced with a completely new set of ideas. Now just think, this guy goes in that hospital, a New York City stock speculator, filled with shame and fear and guilt and remorse, filled with dishonesty and resentments and all the things that go with practicing alcoholism. And in that thing he had a spiritual experience in that hospital. Now let's look at his attitude right after that. He said, while I lay in the hospital, the thought that came that there were thousands of alcoholics who might be glad to have what I had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. My friend, and this time it's a little f, he's talking about Abby, my friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. Particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Faith without works was dead, he said, and how appallingly true for the alcoholic. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. If he did not work, he would surely drink again, and if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed, and with us it's just like that. Thank God Bill remembered this when he was in Akron. Thank God he remembered in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel that even though I've never helped anybody in New York City, every time I've tried, I felt better. Thank God he made some phone calls and got hold of Dr. Bob. He didn't go there to sober up Dr. Bob. He went there to keep Bill Wilson from getting drunk. And thank God it worked. Not only did Dr. Bob sober up, but Bill didn't have to get drunk. And Bill spent the rest of his life not trying to make large sums of money, not trying to prove to the world that he was important, not trying to be the top of the heap. He spent the rest of his life, devoted it entirely to trying to help other alcoholics recover from alcoholism. Something profound took place in his life in the town's hospital, a complete change of attitude. And that's what a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening is. A psychic change or a change in personality. Bill experienced it in the towns.
The work is